All of this is happening today, of course, down in Miami. It's going to be happening just in a couple of hours now. And we're already seeing protesters gather there outside the courthouse because, again, this is a big deal. Now, it's like, okay, well, it's happening over and over and over again, right? We saw the whole thing there with the whole Stormy Daniels situation just a few weeks ago, and Alvin Bragg making a name for himself in New York City. Well, this is a little different because it is the federal government. That was state. This is federal. So therefore, kind of a bigger deal. And the charges here stem from, well, espionage. I mean, that's a pretty serious thing to be leveling on a former president of the United States. But like I said, there are new polls, and we're going to get to those momentarily, because what they're sort of showing you here in this polling data is that, wow, it's like Donald Trump has kind of made a Teflon. It actually hasn't hurt him one single bit. In fact, it's actually helping him right now. And you compare and contrast where he is versus, say, Ron DeSantis, and he continues to gain steam with the latest poll coming to us via CBS and now showing Donald Trump above 60%. I mean, that is a very, very high level, indicating that, again, he is going to be the nominee for the GOP unless they find some kind of loophole to take him down. And that indeed becomes the question. I think that's why you're actually seeing more and more people beginning to throw their hat in the ring. That's why maybe we saw Chris Christie come in there, because he thought, okay, well, now there's an opening for me. Ron DeSantis, he's sort of the presumptive guy, right? Like, he's the number 2 there. Well, does he continue to pick up momentum if, in fact, Donald Trump moves to the side? Right now, we're not seeing that. Donald Trump has every card stacked against him, at least from, the feds coming in and saying enough is enough. And yet he continues to rise in the polls, perhaps because a lot of people that were conservatives that maybe were like, okay, like, I'm sick of this. Like, I just can't deal with the drama. And they're like, wait a second, what exactly is going on? And they're comparing, for example, what is going on with Donald Trump to what happened with Hillary Clinton. And they don't like what they see, because they're saying, why is it that James Comey would not go after Hillary Clinton, and yet he's willing to go after Donald Trump? Alan Dershowitz, who was just on the show the other day, had a very good piece, very interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal today. Now, Alan Dershowitz has been a pretty big supporter of Donald Trump. In fact, going so far as on this show to say that the former president's constitutional rights had really been trampled on. Yet when he saw this indictment, he admitted full on, he said, look, this is much stronger than I would have thought. This indictment is it's better than I would have thought. All that said, it's still a big deal to indict a former president. This is historic. And so his question, and he writes in the Wall Street Journal, was whether or not this really justified the indictment. How can you justify an indictment of the leading candidate to challenge the president in next year's election? Alan Dershowitz from Harvard University writes, even with the recorded statements, he said, this one isn't nearly as strong as the one that led to President Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974. Nixon was almost certainly guilty of destroying evidence, bribing witnesses, and other acts of obstruction. Many of the charges in this case are matters of degree. Nor have prosecutors any evidence, he writes, that Mr. Trump's actions damaged national security more than those of Mr. Biden, Mr. Pence, and Mrs. Clinton. Don't forget, of course, they found those documents in, the garage in Delaware, Biden's garage, right next to his Corvette. He kept telling us, right next to my Corvette. I kept it in the locked garage next to my Corvette. We're very proud of you, Joe Biden, that you've worked this hard and you managed to get yourself a Corvette, which you keep locked up in the garage next to your classified papers. You see, the other issue there was that he was keeping them at his quote-unquote office, which was that place in D.C. that was put together by the University of Pennsylvania with some funding, interestingly enough, from China, because apparently, the money just kept pouring in when they announced that Biden was going to run this little think tank, and some of the documents were there as well. So obviously, this makes people kind of nervous. And then you got Trump's documents, which apparently were in the bathroom at Mar-a-Lago and in maybe a ballroom, and there were 120 boxes. And so I think Dershowitz is making some very good points. In other words, what is the distinction? What is the difference? And will they be able to prove that? Again, it's a pretty high bar because you know what? You guys are doing some really crazy stuff. You, Joe Biden, your administration is going after the guy who's going to be competing against you, running against you. And that just in and of itself feels really, really uncomfortable. He goes on to say, this is Alan Dershowitz, longtime professor at Harvard. By the way, a huge liberal. Like, this is not exactly a guy that would be voting for Trump. He's voted for Democrats his entire life, he told me. In fact, even in the last election, voted for Joe Biden. But he goes on to write, when an incumbent administration prosecutes the leading candidate against the president, it should have a case that is so compelling that it attracts the kind of bipartisan support that forced Nixon to resign. No such support is currently apparent, since many Republicans continue to be troubled by the targeting of Mr. Trump. Mr. Smith, he's referring, of course, to the prosecutor, will have to convince not only a Miami jury, but the American public on both sides of the partisan divide. And that is going to be tough to do. Indeed.